All right, next set of slides here is regarding a little more deeper dive into epithelial tissue. So as we know with epithelial tissue, we had stratified, which meant many layers of cells. We had simple, which is one layer. We knew that there were three kinds of cell shapes that were involved, and they all had sort of, again, that structure governs function thing. Depending on the cells that make up the epithelium, of course, has its specific roles to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through all the simple tissues, and then we're going to go through all the stratified tissues. So we can see here in the simples, we have 4 different tissues we need to go through. And within the context of whether it's simple squamous epithelium or simple columnar, we need a description of it. We're going to talk about its function, and then we're going to talk about where it's found in the body. And these are the things you need to know. And I will be asking examination questions in regard to it. So, you can sort of break down your study purposes, from your sort of breaking it down into all your simple tissues. Which cell is it? What's it look like? What's its function, and where do you find it? So let's do simple squamous first. It's a single layer of squamous cells with the primary function of filtration and diffusion. It can't protect. It's too thin. It has to be thin to allow things to move through it, but it's not strong enough to deal with any kind of trauma. So one of the places we find it is in the lining of the alveoli of the lungs, and this is the structures within the lungs that allows for gases to pass both ways, carbon dioxide out of the lungs and oxygen into the bloodstream. There are some modifications that result in specialized forms of this tissue. The first is called endothelium. If you remember your terminology, endo, of course, means within. So this particular endothelium lines the chambers of the heart. It lines all the blood vessels in the human body and all the lymphatic vessels, and it forms the walls of the capillaries. And we'll get into this a lot deeper when we get into the cardiovascular lectures. But fundamentally, I call it like the Teflon. It lines all these structures that allows fluids to, blood or lymph to slide along and not have a problem. The second place we find it is called mesothelium with a specialized type. And this represents those serous membranes that we talked about in the first week or two of having it folding over with the serous fluid and so on and so forth. So it does make up the serous membranes of the body, this simple squamous epithelium. Again, we can see here is your basement membrane, your connective tissue. Here is your basement membrane. And you can see it is a single layer or one layer of squamous shaped cells. Our next type of simple tissue is simple cuboidal. And of course, it is a single layer of cuboidal cells. Its primary function is secretion and absorption. Of course, absorption would be similar to simple squamous, but these cuboidal cells play a bit of a different role in that they help with secretions. Therefore, we find them in the linings of the ovaries and the smaller ducts of many of the glands that we find throughout the body. Again, our connective tissue, basement membrane, and a single layer of cuboidal cells. The simple tissues of columnar, there are 2 types, and that has to do with what's on top of the apical layer. So the first is called non-ciliated simple columnar. It is a single layer of columnar cells which function as secretive and absorptive cells. So they secrete as well, and they do absorb. We tend to find non-ciliated simple columnar in the lining of the GI tract from the stomach to the anus. Usually what we find on the apical surface are what are called microvilli. What these are extensions that come out the top that you can see here. And fundamentally what these microvilli are doing are extremely increasing the surface area of this tissue. So imagine the surface area of each of these microvilli times the number of microvilli we see here. You can say it really does change how much surface area is available for absorption, for example. Now, because of where we find this tissue, we also find a particular cell called a goblet cell. And these goblet cells secrete mucus, which will then run over the top of the microvilli here. And these quite often act as a lubricant, for example, for things to move along. But again, when you get that stuffy nose with the cold, it is goblet cells in the mucous membranes inside the nose that get irritated with inflammation and overproduce mucus. Hence the reason why when we have a head cold, we've got, we have to blow our nose and so forth. Okay, so we did non-ciliated simple columnar. Now we're going to do ciliated simple columnar. Same idea. Again, a single layer of columnar cells, which has cilia on the apical surface. And it has the function of moving compounds over the surface of the epithelium. And it too contains goblet cells. So what's the difference? Non-ciliated columnar has microvilli, which increases surface area for absorption. Ciliated columnar contains something called cilia. And the cilia's role is to move things. So we've already talked a little bit about it in previous cells, but the whole purpose of cilia is to move things along its surface. So this is not about surface area absorption, and this is about moving things along. So we say it has the function of moving compounds over the surface of the epithelium, and it does contain goblet cells as well, because again, mucus can act as a lubricant to allow things to move along. And because it moves things along, we find it in the respiratory tract, the fallopian tubes, which is part of the female reproductive system, and the uterus itself as well. That role there, moving the egg or the ovum along to where it needs to go. Pseudostratified, we've already talked a bit about it, but of course this is a single layer of epithelial cells of different heights, but not all touching the basement membrane, but not all touching the apical surface. Therefore, it gives the impression of being stratified, even though it is not. It usually has cilia on its apical surface, and the ciliated form also contains these goblet cells that produce mucus, and is found lining a large majority of the upper respiratory tract. There is a non-ciliated type, and it's found lining the epididymis and part of the eustachian tube. The epididymis is an area in the male reproductive tract where sperm, once created, mature. And the eustachian tube is the tube that's found in the inner ear. And of course, again, because of this, we have secretory functions here through the goblet cells, and the cilia act as movement cells, or responsible for movement that moves things along, when we can see the cilia here. So we're going to do exactly the same thing with stratified tissues. There are 4 types. There is stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, transitional. Same idea. We want to describe it, we want to talk about its function, and we want to know where to find it in the human body. Remember, we always name a tissue by the shape of the most apical cell. So when I say that something is a stratified squamous, that tells you that the upper cells, the most apical cells of this tissue, are squamous in shape. So in stratified squamous, usually the underlying cells are cuboidal or columnar in nature. The upper several layers are what are squamous, and this particular tissue has an extremely high turnover rate. New cells are replacing old dying cells at a very high rate. So we say that as the apical cells are lost, because they're the ones that are kind of exposed to the outside world, the basal cells move up and then replace them. So therefore, because of the thickness, its primary function is protection. So we can see here the most basal cells are cuboidal in shape. And as we move towards the apical surface, we can see they're becoming more squamous in shape, with the upper couple of layers being completely squamous in terms of shape, and therefore it's named because of the most apical cell. So there are 2 forms, a keratinized form and a non-keratinized. So keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, within the cells, it has a protein called keratin, and this protein is deposited on the surface cells. So we can see here in the diagram, for example, this kind of represents your skin, which we'll be talking about, but you can see that many of the cells here have nuclei in them, so they're alive cells. But you can see up here near the top, there are no nuclei. Those cells are dead, and they are completely filled with keratin. So when we talk about keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, we have keratin that's deposited on the surface cells, or even within the surface cells. So therefore, this forms the outer layer of the skin, and this keratin helps act as a waxy coat for skin, and it does make the skin waterproof. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Same idea, many layers thick with the apical surface cells being squamous in shape, but they're not keratinized, so they're softer in nature, if you want to call it that. So we tend to find this in the moist areas of the body, lining the mouth, the anus, vagina, and tongue. Now, if we say that its primary function is to protect, then the keratinized, of course, is very strong, that that your skin facing the outside world. And when we talk about non-keratinized, it's still protection because it's many layers thick. But again, we think of the areas of that listed here, the mouth, anus, vagina, and tongue. There is some shall we say, minor trauma that can happen in this area for lots of different reasons. And this part of the body is able to deal with those. Our next is stratified cuboidal. Of course, 2 or more layers of the cells being cuboidal in shape. It is a somewhat uncommon tissue, but it is found lining the ducts of adult sweat glands and part of the male urethra. And again, it's part of production. And one of the reasons I may say, adult sweat glands, of course, is, it's protecting the duct itself. And in the male urethra, believe it or not, what it's actually protecting is because the male urethra shares both the renal system for urine and the respiratory system for ejaculate and sperm. This protection of these cuboidal cells and associated mucus that's in the area, it protects the sperm from an environment that the sperm wouldn't be able to last. So we can see here connective tissue, basement membrane, and more than one layer of cuboidal cells. Next is stratified columnar, 2 or more layers with the surface layer being columnar. Extremely important in protection. It's found lining part of the male urethra, large excretory ducts and portions of the anus. It also functions in secretion. So we can see here, in this case, we might have more cuboidal cells deep, but then definitely columnar on the more apical surface. We've already talked a bit about transitional. There's appearance of many cells within it. It goes from stratified squamous to stratified cuboidal, depending on the degree of distension. And the primary function of this tissue is to stretch or distend. And we find it lining the urinary bladder and portions of both the urethra. And by the way, the urethra is the tube that transfers urine from the bladder to the outside world, and the ureters, which is the tube that runs from the kidneys to the bladder, thus bringing urine in towards the urinary bladder. So we can see it here, it can transition between the two depending on how much it's being stretched. Now, that I talked about before, I said, the 2 functions of epithelial tissue. Well, the second form of it is also epithelial tissue makes up glands. So we say that this tissue forms the glands. And of course, glands, their primary function is to secrete. A gland can be as small as a single cell or contain thousands to millions of cells. And there are 2 major classifications: exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Now, exocrine glands are glands that secrete their products onto an epithelial surface, such as your skin or lining of the GI tract, via a duct. So we can see this is the duct here. So our gland is down here. Here's your skin, and you can see that you have this duct pathway that has the secretions travel up the duct to go out onto the surface. I'm not going to go through all these, but just understand there are many different shapes and sizes to ducts in the human body, and they have various different compounds that they secrete. But fundamentally, you can see that every one of these shapes has a duct system, and that there's an opening on the apical surface that secretes their compound. So types of secretions we see are mucus, oil, sweat, wax, and enzymes. Examples are sweat glands, salivary glands, which are in the mouth, and the mammary glands, of course, that create and express milk for the young child. These glands can be further classified on structure by breaking them down into unicellular or multicellular. A unicellular gland we've already talked about, that's one cell, is the goblet cell, which of course creates and expresses or secretes mucus onto the apical surface of epithelial tissue. And the cells within the pancreas or the salivary gland are multicellular in nature. Again, gland, duct, and then secretes onto the apical surface. Exocrine glands secrete their compounds by one of three routes. The first is called a holocrine gland, and this is a gland that releases their created compound by releasing an entire cell into the duct. The compound to be released is stored in the cytosol of that particular cell, and then the released cell is eventually replaced by a new cell, and this is how you express oil in your oil gland. So you can see here that the top part here, the mature cell dies, and the secretions that were created, the oil, expresses out into the duct and then heads off on through that duct to the apical surface. So you can see it's a single cell that produces it, and then it erupts and releases the created oil within the cytoplasm itself. The second type are apocrine glands. They accumulate their compound on the apical surface, so that would be the surface that's facing the duct, and then the apical portion is pinched off of the cell when the compound is to be released, and after the secretion, the apical portion is repaired. This represents your mammary and sweat glands. So again, here's your nucleus, your endoplasmic reticulum, your Golgi apparatus. You can see it creates these vesicles that migrate to the apical surface of the cell. That apical surface is then pinched off, which releases the secretion. That pinched off portion repairs, and then we start all over again. This is an apocrine gland. The next one is a merocrine gland. They release their compounds through exocytosis. So there's no destruction of the cell or breaking away of the cell membrane. The compound is released in the cytoplasm and through a vesicle migrating to the apical surface. The compound within the vesicle is released through exocytosis. So therefore we can say only the compound is released, and therefore there is no repair. This is the most common form of exocrine gland secretion, and this represents your salivary gland. So you can see again, here's your nucleus, your rough endoplasmic reticulum, your Golgi complex or apparatus, and then these secretory vesicles migrate to the apical surface, where through exocytosis the compound is released out into the duct. Now, endocrine glands are slightly different. So exocrine glands had a duct system, and they were releasing their products out onto the apical surface. Endocrine glands are gland, and sometimes they are quite often made of epithelial tissue, but the difference is they secrete their compounds directly into the bloodstream. They do not use a duct. So if they do not have a duct that goes to an apical surface, endocrine glands secrete their compounds directly into blood. These glands secrete a compound called hormones. And these hormones are chemicals which regulate the physiological processes of the body. They are very powerful. You probably know many of them. So the sex hormones are testosterone and estrogen, and you have something like thyroid hormones which control metabolism. So there are some glands that function both as exocrine and endocrine, and this is the pancreas. The pancreas has both an endocrine portion and an exocrine portion. The endocrine portion of the pancreas secretes insulin and glucagon, thereby controlling glucose levels within blood, maintaining the homeostatic amounts in blood at any given time through either lowering blood glucose or increasing blood glucose. Insulin lowers blood glucose by having glucose go into cells, and glucagon is found in the liver, and it breaks down glycogen into glucose to increase glucose in blood. The exocrine portion of the pancreas secretes digestive enzymes and sodium bicarbonate into the GI tract. So it's very much a part of the breaking down of the foods that we eat. And you'll be talking about that in the GI phys and anatomy next semester. So we can see here we've got these alpha cells here that secrete glucagon, which releases glucose. Here's your beta cells here that create insulin, which decreases glucose in the blood by driving glucose into cells. Thanks for listening to this group. There's one more slide left to go, just the leftover tissues we have to briefly talk about. Thanks again for listening.